Say something to the camera. Say something to the camera. Say something to... Okay, I don't want no more. Say something to the camera. Don't act camera shy. Look. Say dada. Yeah.
A single father steps out for a late-night meetup with someone he's only known through Instagram. Hours later, he's lying on the pavement of a residential Indianapolis street, shot multiple times. His phone is tossed. The woman who was with him, gone. Jarrell Pryor thought he was building something new. What he walked into was already planned. Here on True Crime Case Tapes, we examine how one message became the first move in a deadly setup. Like, share, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Before anyone heard gunshots or pieced together text messages, there was just Jarrell. Jarrell Lamont Pryor, 26, lived on the east side of Indianapolis. To his daughter Honey, he was Dada, the man who tucked her in, carried her on his shoulders, and never missed a weekend. To others, he was someone you wanted around, the guy who could smooth over arguments with a joke, break out a dance move at a barbecue, and remind you not to take life too seriously. He wasn't a public figure. He didn't go viral. He didn't chase attention. What he did chase was stability, for his child, for himself, and for the future he was determined to create. Gerald worked long hours at a local warehouse, stacking and sorting inventory without complaint. He'd grown up with that ethic: start early, work hard, and take care of yours. But he also held on to his individuality. At school, he once brought down the auditorium with a Michael Jackson tribute routine. He loved to game, and even dreamed of turning that passion into a career. That kind of imagination stayed with him, even as he navigated adult responsibilities. Honey was at the center of everything. She was 3 years old, and the light of his life. Gerald co-parented with his ex-girlfriend, and while their romantic relationship had ended, their cooperation never did. He stayed connected with her family, often helping put her younger siblings to bed, treating them like part of his own circle. Friends say he wasn't just present, he was intentional. The kind of father who made time count. At home, he lived with his mother Tamikia and his stepfather Travis, who described Honey as the spitting image of him. There were plans. Jarrell talked about getting his own place, maybe starting a small business one day. He still sold snacks on the side sometimes, just like he did in grade school, a nod to the hustler mentality he'd carried since childhood. His community saw him as solid, someone who was always working, always helping, always hopeful. His friend Anijah Randall remembered nights when Jarrell hosted movie marathons with Honey nestled next to him on the couch. Even if you were mad at him, she said, you couldn't stay mad. He'd make you laugh whether you wanted to or not. That Friday in January started like any other. Work during the day. Texts back and forth in the evening. He'd been chatting with someone new on Instagram, a young woman who seemed interested in meeting up. Jarrell wasn't naive, but he was open to new connections. He got dressed, likely threw on cologne, maybe even showed off a fresh haircut. For a few hours, he wasn't just a dad or an employee. He was 26, still young enough to be curious about what life might bring next. There were no red flags, no warnings, no reason for concern. What Gerald didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that someone else had also been watching the messages, and someone else had been making a different plan entirely. Whatever Gerald expected from that night, it wasn't betrayal, but the messages on his phone would soon tell a story no one saw coming. By early evening on January 24th, 2025, the forecast in Indianapolis was mild for winter, nothing unusual. Traffic rolled steadily across East 38th, and store lights blinked open along the north side. Somewhere between his last text and a turn of the ignition, Jarrell Pryor headed out to meet someone he'd never seen in person. They had exchanged direct messages, photos, and light-hearted banter. She told him her name was Alexis. She seemed interested, maybe even excited. The plan wasn't fancy, no reservations, no big event, just meet up, talk a bit, and see where the night went. From all accounts, Jarrell didn't overthink it. He agreed to pick her up. The idea was simple: connect, grab something to eat, maybe cruise around a bit, and talk. For a guy who juggled warehouse hours and preschool pickup, this wasn't a reckless night out, it was a rare window of personal time. Once Alexis got into the car, The tone shifted slightly. Not enough to cause alarm, but noticeable in hindsight. She didn't seem interested in sitting down anywhere long. According to what police would later reconstruct, she steered them toward faster, more flexible options. Jarrell went along with it. He wasn't pushy. If she wanted McDonald's instead of a restaurant, no problem. They pulled into a fast food drive-thru. The timestamps from nearby security cameras would later confirm their presence around 11:40 p.m. Next came a detour. A liquor store not far from the residential zones east of Keystone Avenue. Security footage shows Jarrell and Alexis inside briefly, grabbing something to take with them. This was the last public sighting of them together. It was just after 12:15 a.m. on January 25th. What happened between that final transaction and what came next is marked only by silence. No security cameras followed their drive. No streetlights captured the exact stop. But at approximately 1:10 a.m., Jarrell's car was seen parked near the corner of East 49th Street and Primrose Avenue, a stretch of road flanked by quiet homes, yards, and sparse lighting. What we do know is that this is where the night turned. Several minutes later, multiple residents called 911 reporting sounds they believed were gunshots. One caller thought it might have been fireworks, but the urgency in their voice suggested otherwise. First responders were dispatched to the area by 1:20 a.m. What they found was unsettling. Jarrell was outside the vehicle, face down on the street, bleeding heavily. His phone was found several feet away. His car door stood open, engine still warm. There was no one else in sight. Paramedics worked quickly, loading him into an ambulance and rushing him to the hospital. He had suffered multiple gunshot wounds, later confirmed to be to the chest, abdomen, jaw, and back. It was a level of violence that didn't match the simplicity of the scene. There was no evidence of an altercation, no shattered glass, no overturned seats or signs of a physical struggle inside the vehicle. It all appeared to have happened within seconds. And Alexis, gone. She wasn't mentioned in any witness statements. She didn't wait for help. She wasn't spotted in the surrounding blocks. It would be hours before investigators would even confirm her name, and days before they understood just how closely she had been involved. Jarrell was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after arrival. Back on the street, crime scene tape marked off the intersection. Detectives worked under floodlights. No weapon was found nearby, but there was one object that stood out amid the chaos. Jarrell's phone. Whatever this night had been, whoever had been with him, the answers might still be stored inside that device. Texts, DMs, search history, geolocation pings. The following morning, police began tracking every digital interaction from the previous 24 hours. They didn't know it yet, but the timeline they were building would tell a story very different from a date gone wrong. The phone that Jarrell left behind would become the loudest witness in a case that so far had left nothing but questions. Detectives began with what was right in front of them, Jarrell's phone. It hadn't been locked, which meant everything inside was accessible the moment they powered it on. The messages they found weren't long or dramatic. They were casual, a back and forth between Jarrell and a woman named Alexis Hawkins, the same name attached to the contact that had sent him a location pin earlier that evening. Their chat history stretched back several days. The tone was flirtatious, but nothing unusual. A few exchanged photos, a plan to link up that weekend, and confirmation of where to meet. Everything pointed to a low-stakes date between two people trying to get to know each other. But beneath those messages, buried just out of sight, was something very different. Jarrell wasn't the only person Alexis had been texting. Within the same time frame, Alexis had also been messaging someone else. The tone wasn't romantic, it was transactional. In those messages, she referred to a lick, slang commonly used to describe a robbery target. She didn't say Jarrell's name directly, but the timing aligned exactly with her texts to him. 1 minute she was confirming plans with Jarrell. The next, she was telling someone else, making a play real fast. That other person? An 18-year-old named Brian K. Winston Jr. With a search warrant, investigators accessed more of Alexis's social media activity. What they uncovered reshaped the entire case. Alexis hadn't stumbled into this situation. She had a documented pattern of reaching out to men online, arranging meetups, and using that contact to stage thefts. Several messages reviewed by police showed her pitching herself as someone willing to help others get a come-up, code for helping rob unsuspecting individuals. In one message sent just days before the shooting, she told a contact, "Been trying to find some licks if you need me to rob anybody down here." That wasn't set confession. It was a job offer. By now, the case had shifted completely. What initially looked like a robbery gone wrong was beginning to resemble something planned. Surveillance footage helped confirm this. Reviewing video from the liquor store earlier that night, detectives matched Alexis's face to social media photos. Her presence in the car with Jarrell before the shooting was now verified, but she wasn't listed as a witness. She hadn't called for help. She didn't check in after. In fact, she disappeared from the narrative entirely after 1:15 a.m. until her search history gave her away. Later that day, Alexis used her phone to look up news today near me and shootings Keystone. Keystone Avenue runs just blocks from the area where Jarrell was shot. That alone wasn't proof of guilt. People get curious, but what followed raised the stakes. In that same hour, Alexis sent out multiple messages asking for a ride. She didn't say from where, but geolocation data suggested she was near the crime scene when the requests went out. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't grieving. She was trying to leave. And she wasn't messaging Jarrell. She wasn't asking if he was okay. She wasn't checking in to explain anything. To detectives, this pointed not only to presence, but to knowledge. She knew what had happened, and she knew who else was involved. The next step was locating her. Alexis was tracked down within days. She had been staying with acquaintances, no longer living at home. Her mother had reportedly asked her to leave just 2 days after Gerald was killed, though it's unclear whether the timing was a coincidence or not. On February 6th, she was brought in for questioning. From the start, Alexis played vague. She told investigators she couldn't remember what happened that night. When pressed, she added, "There's seps no gun to say I did anything. My fingerprints aren't sep on anything." At that point, no one had even mentioned a weapon. It was a response that caught the room off guard. The detectives hadn't accused her of pulling a trigger. They were still trying to determine what role, if any, she had played. But the way she centered her defense, distancing herself from the shooting, only made their suspicion sharper. Then came the moment that shifted the tone. Investigators showed her one of her own messages, making a play real fast. They asked her what that meant. Alexis went silent. Then she asked for a lawyer. The interview ended there. To police, her abrupt shutdown was more telling than anything she'd said out loud. She hadn't denied the message. She hadn't offered a different meaning. She had simply removed herself from the conversation. By then, detectives already suspected someone else was involved. They just hadn't named him publicly yet. But inside Alexis's phone, in a short exchange sent at dawn on January 25th, one thread stood out. "Isam home." She had typed at 5:20 a.m. The response came seconds later. "Don't say too much. And then delete these messages too way." The sender was Brian Winston Jr. And the case was about to widen. The search for Jarrell's killer was no longer a mystery. It was now a manhunt. By the time police linked Brian K. Winston Jr. to the case, nearly 2 weeks had passed since the night Jarrell Pryor was killed. He wasn't hard to find, at first. Brian lived in Indianapolis. He was 18 years old, recently out of school, and had a limited prior history with police. But he wasn't naive. Once Alexis was brought in for questioning, Brian went dark. No public posts, no traceable movements, no phone activity tied directly to his name. Behind the scenes, investigators were building the case. They had enough to believe Brian had been the gunman based on Alexis's digital trail and his own messages. He hadn't admitted anything directly, but the timing of his texts, particularly the ones sent in the early morning hours after Jarrell's death, pointed to intimate knowledge of the crime. Still, suspicion isn't set arrest. What they needed was contact. On February 11th, police attempted to bring Brian in. They approached a known address on Indianapolis's northeast side, believed to be connected to him through previous contacts. But Brian wasn't there. According to individuals at the residence, he had left the city. No further details were offered. It quickly became clear he wasn't just avoiding an interview, he was gone. An arrest warrant was issued, and the U.S. Marshals were brought in. Phone metadata provided the break. While Brian had avoided using accounts tied to his real name, certain app logins were traced to a mobile IP in Central Texas. Investigators believed he was hiding out in Austin, over 1,000 miles away from where the shooting occurred. By early March, local authorities in Texas were notified. The task force tracked activity to a residential complex in the East Riverside area of Austin. On March 7th, U.S. Marshals, working alongside Austin police, executed a quiet but targeted takedown. Brian was located inside a unit without incident and taken into custody. He did not resist. At the time of arrest, he had no weapon on him, and he gave no statement. He was held initially in Texas, then extradited back to Indiana under supervision. With both suspects now in custody, the case reached a turning point. It was no longer about theories. The prosecution had names, timestamps, locations, and digital evidence. What they didn't have, and what they may never fully obtain, was motive in plain language. Neither Alexis nor Brian confessed. No explanation was provided for why Jarrell Pryor, a man with no criminal history, no connection to either suspect prior to this setup, had been targeted. The probable cause affidavit laid out the timeline. Alexis made contact with Gerald over Instagram. She arranged the meetup and rode in the car with him. She communicated with Brian during the outing using coded language. Brian was allegedly waiting in the area where Gerald was later shot. After the incident, both exchanged messages suggesting concealment and urgency. But one piece remained missing: physical evidence placing Brian at the scene. The weapon was never recovered. No DNA or fingerprint evidence tied him directly to the shooting location. What prosecutors had was circumstantial but layered, and in court, layers can speak volumes. The language in the charges reflected the seriousness of the case. Brian faced counts of murder, robbery resulting in serious bodily injury, conspiracy to commit robbery, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Because of his age and the nature of the offense, all charges were filed in adult criminal court. Indiana's statutes allow for direct filing in murder cases once a suspect is 18 or older. Alexis was charged alongside him, facing similar counts, but her role, and whether she would be tried as a co-defendant or separately, was still under review. As the two sat in separate cells, neither gave interviews. Their legal teams declined to speak publicly. The only voices coming forward were from Gerald's family and community. To them, the arrest brought a form of clarity, but not closure. There was still no answer to the most painful question: why? Why target a man who had never threatened anyone? Why set him up, rob him, and leave him to die in the street? And why did it take a digital breadcrumb trail to bring any of this into the light? The legal system was now in motion, but what would justice even look like in a case where silence had done most of the talking? With both defendants in custody, prosecutors now faced the challenge of turning a digital paper trail into courtroom accountability. Alexis S. Hawkins and Brian K. Winston Jr. were formally charged in Marion County with multiple felonies: murder, robbery, resulting in serious bodily injury, and conspiracy to commit robbery. For Brian, an additional firearm possession charge was filed. Though neither had offered a confession, the prosecution's case didn't depend on spoken admissions, it relied on coordination. At the core of the case was intent. Prosecutors pointed to the timing of the messages, the wording used between Alexis and Brian, and the coordinated drop-off near the shooting site. They argued that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a pre-arranged ambush that ended in homicide. But establishing intent without direct statements is a steep legal climb. That's where the concept of felony murder comes in. Under Indiana law, a person can be charged with murder if a killing occurs during the commission of another felony, such as robbery, even if they didn't personally pull the trigger. That statute applies to accomplices, getaway drivers, planners, and bait figures. If the state could prove Alexis lured Jarrell under false pretenses and Brian acted on that plan, both could be held equally responsible for the outcome. Still, defense teams were expected to challenge the assumptions built into that logic. Alexis's side hinted at an argument rooted in misinterpretation, that her texts were vague, slang-filled, and open to multiple meanings. Her attorneys signaled that they would question whether she knew what Brian was going to do, or whether she thought this was simply a setup for theft. not murder. Brian's team, for their part, declined to comment, but legal observers anticipated a distancing strategy. With no weapon recovered and no physical evidence placing him directly at the scene, they could argue that the prosecution lacked conclusive proof that Brian was the shooter, despite the message he sent telling Alexis to delete these messages. The court filings didn't offer a motive. There was no stated reason Jarrell had been chosen, no evidence of previous disputes, debts, or personal history. That lack of context made the case harder for jurors to emotionally connect with, but in legal terms it underscored the cold structure of the crime. Everything prosecutors knew came from phones, timestamps, word choices, search queries, location data. In a world where nearly every move leaves a trace, it was the devices, not the defendants, doing the talking. Still, there's a gap between digital evidence and real-world justice. Jarrell's family waited in the background as the slow machinery of pretrial hearings and legal motions began. The public defender system moved cautiously. Evidence review took time. Neither Alexis nor Brian had posted bail. As of mid-2025, both remained in pretrial detention, their cases pending. The community that knew Gerald continued to speak his name. Friends and family wore shirts printed with his image, held gatherings in his honor, and posted tributes online. Reminders that this wasn't just another headline or docket number. It was a test case for how well the law responds when the motive is muted, the suspects stay silent, and the only witnesses are digital threads. Subscribe to True Crime Case Tapes for more real cases that demand answers. Next week, we examine a similar case where an online connection turned fatal, but this time, the person targeted made it out alive. But even as the legal process moved forward, those closest to Jarrell were left grappling with a deeper, unspoken question: what if no sentence can ever match what was taken? When news of Jarrell's death reached his family, disbelief came first. Then the questions followed, none of them with answers. His mother, Tamekia, struggled to process how her son, a young father known for his warmth and humor, could be gone in a matter of hours. Just days earlier, he'd been sitting in their living room, playing with Honey, folding laundry, and cracking jokes about whose turn it was to cook. Now there was silence in the spaces he once filled. 3-year-old Honey didn't understand what had happened. At first, she kept asking for data, waiting at the door like she had dozens of times before. Her grandmother did her best to explain, in terms small enough for a toddler, yet heavy enough to break any adult's heart. The absence of a father is loudest in the everyday moments. School drop-offs, birthdays, the lullabies no one else knew how to sing. Jarrell's older cousin stepped in. Friends from the neighborhood brought food, made calls, and helped cover funeral costs. His ex and her family stayed close, refusing to let grief become an island. In those first few weeks, everyone did what they could to keep Jarrell's memory present, not just with tears, but with stories. There were stories about his goofiness, how he used to moonwalk at family parties, about how he couldn't stand mismatched socks, about how he once took a side job dressed as a mascot just to afford Honey's first birthday photo shoot. Every one of those stories made people laugh and then cry. Outside the family home, something else was happening. Community groups began talking more openly about digital safety, not just in terms of scams or privacy, but personal interaction. The idea that someone could use charm or flirtation to bait a setup wasn't new. But Jarrell's story made it real. Parents began asking their teens more questions, young adults re-examined their social media habits, and local advocates used the case to launch awareness efforts around targeted digital luring, a term not everyone knew, but one that now hit close to home. For many in Indianapolis, Jarrell wasn't just a victim, he was a mirror. He represented the friend who works hard and keeps to himself, the dad trying to co-parent without drama, the guy who minds his business but still believes in giving people a chance. His family decided early on that they wouldn't let his name disappear into a case file. They started a scholarship fund in his honor, small at first, but meaningful. It was designed to support young fathers trying to go back to school or learn a trade, the kind of opportunity Jarrell had hoped to pursue himself. At local events, his daughter's name was often mentioned too. People donated clothes, toys, and art supplies. A community effort quietly grew around helping her feel supported, even in the shadow of loss. But no amount of goodwill could fill the absence. No amount of trial coverage or sentencing, when it comes, will undo what happened in the early hours of January 25th. Gerald's story isn't about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's about how trust can be weaponized, and how quickly a normal night can be rewritten by someone else's agenda. We tell these stories not to dwell on tragedy, but to understand how to prevent the next one. Because behind every statistic is someone like Jarrell, loved, needed, irreplaceable. Let his name remind us to move more carefully in digital spaces, to speak up when we sense manipulation, and to hold each other closer while we still can.